Plurilogue Talks is a conversational space between artists and social scientists that are based in the region, in Arabic, English, and other languages. Our exchange takes the form of a plurilogue, a dialogue that goes beyond two sides. All right, so good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. It is so wonderful to see everybody here. We have our first session of Haraka Lab's Plurilogues for the semester, and I'm particularly delighted because many of the people who are in the room today are students in Women in Work in the Gulf. So this is a wonderful opportunity to bring some of the work that I do in my lab with some of the conversations that are happening in my classroom. I'm also particularly delighted today because we have with us somebody who is not just a colleague of mine, but a very, very dear friend, Laure Assaf, who's an assistant professor of anthropology at NYU Abu Dhabi, and who has been a really important figure in organizing or helping organize an exhibition that recently took place on our campus at the project space. And two of the other people present with us today are people who have put this together. The first is Farah Hallaba. Many of you might know her for her amazing posts on Instagram. She runs this super interesting platform called Anthropology bil Arabi. She's been heavily involved in taking many of the concepts from anthropology as a social science, but really thinking critically about them, and also thinking about questions of language and what it means to engage with these, not just from a kind of copy-paste perspective, but really from kind of a critical and grounded perspective. So she's going to talk a little bit about her role with this exhibition that we're going to be talking about today, Being Borrowed. But we also have present with us Farida Youssef, who is the artistic curator, somebody who played a very pivotal role also in Being Borrowed, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. And with us, you can't see him, but he's here, Ali Zar'i, who is the creative producer for this exhibition. So really, we have four individuals who collaborated together to produce something super, super interesting that happened on our campus. Some of you may have even visited that exhibition, but if you didn't, that's okay. Today, we're going to share with you a little bit about what it was, and also what it potentially did, not just on the short term, but the long term. And so I think just in terms of kind of the order of things, what I'm going to do, I think what I'm going to do is first maybe ask Farah Hallaba to tell us a little bit about conceptually, how did this idea of researching Egyptian migration to the Gulf, how did this happen in a kind of grassroots way? How did she essentially curate a series of conversations and workshops to be able to really get people to talk about their lived experience? Then I'm going to invite Farida to tell us a little bit about her involvement in what it meant to take some of those things, some of those ideas that emerged from Farah's workshops and translate that into essentially kind of artistic products or projects that ended up together creating a kind of exhibition. And so the project space at NYU Abu Dhabi was in fact the second location in which some of this work had been displayed. The first was in fact in Cairo itself. And then after that, I'd like to invite Laure Assaf to share with us a little bit what it was like from her perspective to be working with Farah and with Farida in kind of hosting this exhibition in Abu Dhabi through a series of curated programs. So she engaged with a variety of sites and also organizations across the UAE, not only on our campus, in order to continue to build on and expand the conversations that emerged from this exhibition itself. So really, there's like multiple layers of creativity that are operating with this exhibition, and I am so pleased to be able to be in conversation with Farah, Farida, and Laure about them. And I just wanted to say here that from the perspective of somebody who runs a lab at NYU Abu Dhabi that bridges the arts and the social sciences, one of the most interesting things for me about this work is really this kind of question of what do we make of the kind of conversations that emerge from an exhibition like this? So, you know, how do we think about the kind of knowledge that's being produced here? And typically, at least kind of, you know, if you're in a much more mainstream social sciencey sort of space. You have a very particular set of methods that you use, and you're producing knowledge in a particular way, and that gets published in academic articles or in books, many of which we've read for our class, right? But here we have this thing that is doing something similar, maybe a little bit different as well, but it's being produced in a totally different way, in a very different kind of set of conditions, with very different kinds of constraints, but also potential. And so what I'd love to do in our conversation today is unpack some of that. Like, what does it mean to produce knowledge in this way? What kind of communities get created alongside an exhibition that is touching on very, very important questions that can be asked from this social science perspective? And so I think what I'd like to do is maybe invite Farah, if she'd like to kind of open up the conversation and tell us a little bit about, what led her to convene a group of people that are interested in sharing their own lived experiences about what it meant to be connected to this topic, Gulf migration from an Egyptian perspective. Thanks, Farah.
Thank you, Mai, for this beautiful introduction. And we're very happy to be part of your lab and class and to make this conversation happen. So thank you so much. Okay, I'll try to be brief because I know we want to keep more time for and space for questions, but also for the sound. I'm really in the quietest place in home, but Cairo's soundscape is just, inevitable. So I'm sorry for any sound. That's the quietest I can get in Cairo. But hopefully it wouldn't disturb the conversation. Um, Okay, when I think of the process of being borrowed, I like to think of it as also a series of encounters, because this project wasn't envisioned as how it ended up from the very beginning. It was different encounters that led to the exhibition that happened here, or how it traveled as well to UAE. So yeah, I think of it as encounters of collaborative and creative knowledge production. So I speak about, as you mentioned, how it emerged, and then keep the floor for Farida to speak about how then it turned into an exhibition. So yeah, the first encounter, maybe Laure, can you help me? Yeah, I'd like to always mention that the first encounter was an encounter with the self, actually, where it comes from a very, very personal part, right? Because I grew up in Saudi Arabia myself, but I think the thing that really moved me was the idea that my father is still there, almost 30 years now. Um, and the idea that he's still there and lonely, or I mean alone, given that we all traveled, had a weight and a baggage that I felt like I carry, and I couldn't understand. And I don't know if you know the book Anthropology That Breaks Your Heart, Vulnerable Observer by Roth Behar. Um, where she speaks about how the role of emotions in ethnography and anthropology. And she speaks about that from actually a sense of urgency, that sometimes anthropology starts from a sense of urgency when it engages with emotion. So this is exactly how it started, a sense of urgency, an urgency to problematize this very normalized experience that I and millions of other Egyptians face, and we carry its weight that it was quite untangible. Like we carry something heavy, but we can't really understand it, name it, and engage with it critically. So from here, this invited me to actually anthropologically understand the experience. But in anthropology, we sort of, have to go to the field. And in that case, I wasn't sure what the field or where the field was, right? Is it Egypt? Is it the Gulf? Because it felt like something different, a different place. And it was rather a more embodied place. The field was within us, actually. Um, so this, inspired me sort of to do the second encounter, which is an encounter with a collaborative or a collective sense of questioning. So I decided to do it as a workshop. I had no idea what I would say in these workshops because this experience of migrating to the Gulf, Egyptian migration to the Gulf at least, was very understudied and underrepresented, normalized. So there wasn't as much literature that we can engage with. But I had questions. So this is how I did the workshop. It was like each session was a question where we come and we think of these questions together. So questions around father figure, family dynamics, memory, death, home, all of these things that then translated into different artworks were questions basically that we try to encounter collaboratively through a workshop. And this was like just the poster of the workshop, the open call. Um, Laura, the second one. Please also tell me if I'm running out of time. I'm trying to be very quick and brief. Yeah, so these are some images of the sessions. So it ran around for almost 3 or 4 months. Before we were then also joined by Farida, but then for the most part it was in our studio downtown Cairo, and I just like to mention the place because I believe that part of what kind of knowledge was produced was where was it produced. So if we did the same workshop sessions in a campus or in the garden, or the kind of knowledge would have been slightly different. Not that I'm trying to draw a hierarchy. I'm just pointing out the space where knowledge is produced could have an impact of how at least it would be presented to a wider audience. So through this collaborative engagement with the questions that were very personal yet very anthropological, very social, we were able to realize a lot of patterns together. And that's why I think it was very important to do this together, right? Because it was through the collective that we were able to realize a lot of patterns. We did also depend a lot on pop culture because there was very little literatures, but we watched a lot of representations together, so films and TV shows, and our bodily reactions to these representations that were supposedly representations of our own experiences were also very telling, and they also helped into making us understand sort of this experience. How did we react as well? So we engaged sort of with alternative materials, but then I also problematized a little bit what alternative is. But yeah, so for 3 4 months we questioned this a lot, and then we joined our third encounter, which was the process of exhibition making, and this was where Farida joined, and I would let Farida speak more about this. But from my perspective, like the anthropological gain of this as well was that we, at some point, we thought when we started to realize a lot of things about this experience, we thought that we want to engage and widen these questions to a wider audience that can not only be that we didn't want to put our experiences on display per se, but rather engage or invite a wider audience to be part of these conversations that we created in the workshops. And so we decided to actually turn this into an exhibition where the workshop was an output-oriented kind of workshop. And the productive part of that pedagogically in terms of knowledge production was that I would argue that most of the knowledge produced that then we wrote in the publication that was available in the exhibition, they were really coined in this process, the art making process, right? When every participant get to engage with one of these themes or two with their personal experience, and then put it like critically try to understand it when they were turning their experiences and their emotions into art pieces. So it was pedagogically very productive and anthropologically very productive, and most of the patterns were realized in this phase as well. So yeah, the last I think yeah, this I think Farida would speak about when we were like the curation part. But then, yeah, the last thing I would say is that the last encounter was the encounter with the public. So, for an anthropologist, I also speak about the encounter with the public as in terms of the exhibition from the anthropological perspective, and I will leave the curation part also for Farida. But this encounter was very also productive, and it was like a dream for me as an anthropologist because we sort of like created a field where 4,000 people came in Cairo, 1,200 almost came in UAE, and people were willingly, interrogating the art pieces. So they weren't only people like interlocutors for an anthropologist, but they were also um, co-ethnographers, sort of. They would interrogate these art pieces, try to understand it. The conversations had a lot of things coming up, so people were really part of this ethnographic inquiry, socially and personally. So it sort of felt like the exhibitions were creating a field where we all sort of co-created knowledge and co-owned the products, the art products. So I also see everyone in this project as people who they are like people who we together co-own the knowledge that was produced and co-own the tangible products that were also produced. As an exhibition, of course, each artist has their own artwork, but I mean as a process and as a project, as in something that was produced. So yeah, I tried to be brief. I hope I didn't over kida past the 5 minutes a lot. Yeah, and I keep the floor for Farida.
Yeah, that's
Thank you very much for inviting us, May. It's a pleasure to be able to share the floor with Farah and Laure. Farah is one of a very dear colleague and someone who constantly teaches me a lot about what it means to like you said, produce knowledge very differently and do it with 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 a spirit that I think is unmatched by many. And it was a wonderful chance to actually learn from her to develop this exhibition. And it really did shape how I understood what it meant to be a curator in this project. For me, a curator is someone who stands between the artist or the artifact or whatever has been produced and an audience. And the aim of the curator is kind of to heal whatever is coming from one end to be able to present it in another end. You heal the project or the artist or the artwork not because it needs to be healed, but maybe just because it needs to be opened up a little bit differently to a wider audience. And the question was here: what was I opening up? What was I invited to explore? And how best to deliver it for an audience? So like Farah mentioned, the Gulf experience is an experience that has been lived by many, but never problematized. But it's also a very intimate experience, and maybe that's why not many people actually think that it deserves that much attention, because someone travels, but they still live in a home and they come back and that's it. But one thing that was constantly raised by Farah, her workshop, was the idea of temporality, and that this was a temporary experience. And so the exhibition, both in Cairo and in Abu Dhabi, highlighted this idea of temporariness, but added to it or delivered it in the form of an experience. So I like to think of exhibitions as devices. They're a device for helping us do something differently. Here we understand the Gulf migration as an experience, as a personal experience. And so the best way the exhibition could do this was to turn it into a story. And that was the common factor between both presentations in both countries. It was a story that had a start and an end, that had main characters, that had a space of its own. And our characters were the participants themselves, who all shared something in common in their experiences, that they arrived to the Gulf as children and they left and returned back to Cairo around the age of 18 to enter university. The space where this happens is obviously the Gulf, but it's also these temporary homes. And so we had to question that. And like any character story, you kind of see the arc of the other protagonist, what happens to them all throughout. So we're looking at identity, we're looking at what changes when you live through this experience. Obviously, in Cairo, because this was the first time that we actually opened up this conversation, it was important for me to just sort of tell the story itself. So even the organization of the space and the organization of the artworks was centered around this idea of we are invited into the conversation by looking at it from the perspective of a child who grows up in the Gulf, starts to question what it means to be themselves, what it means to have memories, and what does that home mean just before we return. In Abu Dhabi, however, we had to do things a little bit differently because paradoxically, the exhibition was going back to that very temporary home. And so rather than tell a story, it was more about the exploration of a catharsis. How do you go back? How do you repeat something or an event that might have triggered something? And so the arrival and the return became pivotal. But what we did in this exhibition was that we made memory the last thing that we were actually talking about. So as you can see in the floor plan, people start with the arrival, and then we have the return that comes somewhat in the middle. But the exhibition pathway was kind of like a spiral. And so memory becomes the way for re-engaging with that very process of having traveled to the Gulf. We still had that once upon a time moment with Nurhan's exhibition, with Nurhan's piece. If for those who visited, it was one of the first things that you saw, the two pictures of the little girls. You still had Aya's unpacking moment where we kind of really do try to understand what is this all about. But we ended with this with 4 pieces that talked about memory as an identifier of belonging. Because if we belong, then how do we remember that belonging? And the four works about memory kind of I think in this exhibition they had more of a psychoanalytic twist to them, because it was more about how are you going to analyze, how are you going to revisit the way your mind even plays those tricks on you in light of temporality. And what
Farida, can you give one? Can you just anchor the conversation in like one art piece, maybe Tasneem's, just to give like a super concrete example for people perhaps that didn't have the chance to see the exhibition, to have a bit of a feel for what it was like?
Sure. Actually, you speak of Tasneem's, and I think Tasneem's is a wonderful example in this exhibition. So Tasneem invited us to look at her own memories of the Gulf through the lens of fiction and through the lens of storytelling. We saw memories written down in these albums, not knowing whether they were truthful memories or fictional memories. And we were invited to share or invent our own memories, also without identifying the truth or false elements inside of them. And I think to me, this, especially in this edition of the exhibition, the memory room and this work in particular, they kind of do show the way our memory tricks us in order to makeshift that sort of belonging that was never there because those homes were temporary. And one thing that comes out in both editions is the fact that both identity, home, and memory are never really what they are. In many of the pieces, it is not about the artist presenting what they experienced. I think it's about complicating that experience. And so you can always understand anything in terms of a binary. A home is never fixed, it's also temporary. Who you are is never exactly the same. And even your memory can itself be something that might have been invented. And I think just to conclude, what we have is, or what I really enjoyed about this experience was working with artists who dug very deeply inside either their personal archives or pop culture, like Farah mentioned, and to allow us to see how these can be turned into something that is very intimate. And how do we go about making it not just ambiguous and artistic for the sake of presentation, but still something that is an invitation to reflect together. And it was always very emotional when you walked into the exhibition and you see someone interact and question those the artist initiative. And I think for a curator, that just makes that just really makes you understand your role as not just a co-producer of artworks, but really as a healer in that setting.
Thank you so much, Farida. This is so wonderful, and I love this kind of broad bird's eye view that you gave us of the exhibition in Abu Dhabi. As somebody who actually visited that exhibition, you know, I never got this view from the top because I was navigating it from the inside. So I think this image that you shared with us and this idea of catharsis, I think is really actually quite profound. And I guess the one thing that I would pull out of what you said that I think I'd love to build on, you know, during our Q&A is in some ways how the structure of the exhibition itself changed depending on the location. So it wasn't simply that you just took the exhibition in Egypt and brought it to Abu Dhabi or something like that. But in fact, in the movement of this exhibition, there is something that happens to the logic of the exhibition itself that interacts with the particular location and with people's relationship to that location. So that's really very, very helpful. But perhaps we'll get to hear now from Laure Assaf around the kind of interactions that then happened around this exhibition. So you have those people who produced those artworks that was curated in the space, but it didn't stay in that space. It sort of moved, and it moved among different kinds of communities and different kinds of locations. And Laure, as the curator of that program, can you tell us a little bit more about what that looked like?
Yeah, thank you, May. And it's so great to get the chance to talk again about the exhibition after it ended. You know, and I'm so glad to see everyone again and have the chance to do that. So actually, my first encounter with being borrowed was through the book that was published alongside with the Cairo exhibition that has interviews with the artists, but also research essays. And in fact, this book was brought to my place by a friend who was staying one night, and it was his only copy. So he was like, "Okay, you have one night to read it, and then I'm going back with it. I'm not leaving it with you." So I read it overnight, and a few days later, I got in touch with Farah, and we started working on bringing the exhibition to Abu Dhabi. And the reason why I was struck by this book is that I had been working for more than 10 years on as an anthropologist on a group I've called the Arab Youth of Abu Dhabi that are Emiratis and Arab expatriates of diverse nationalities who grew up here and who were young adults in the 2010s. And so I was looking at how their daily lives are shaped by migration and by the diverse urban environment of the UAE, even if they themselves haven't moved. And some of them ended up returning, like some of the stories that we see in the exhibition. Others stayed on in the UAE, others went elsewhere. And so, but essentially I was looking, so part of the group I was looking at were these second generations who grew up in the Gulf. There are very different relationships to their countries of origin, and also there are different forms of belonging or unbelonging to the Emirates. And so the work that Farah and everyone produced resonated very much with the experiences of my interlocutors, and also with so many others in the UAE. And so that was one of the reasons why I felt compelled to do something with them and to engage further with this work. Another reason is that at the time I was doing this research over 10 years ago, second generation or third generation foreign residents were invisible in official discourses, and they were also mostly invisible in the public sphere. They weren't really acknowledged as a part of the UAE population. And so many of the discussions I was looking at around the question of attachment to place, the sometimes painful experience of temporariness, the desire to stay in the UAE or to leave and return, the forms of longing that this created, the question of where is home for many of these people. All of these discussions at the time were taking place mostly in private, among groups of friends, sometimes within the family, but a lot less, in fact. And so since then, actually, a generation of young artists, both foreign residents and Emiratis in the UAE, had been tackling these themes very directly and very critically. And so in a sense, right, these young adults graduated, some of them went on to become artists, and in the fields of literature, of visual arts, of performance, in the academic field as well, started discussing these issues. And so I had this sense that, there were sort of these parallel voices emerging in both places, looking directly at these questions. So there was also a convergence there, right? It wasn't just in sort of the stories resonating, but also in who was talking and who was starting to express them. And so that coincided also with the creation at NYU Abu Dhabi of the research kitchens that provided funding that made this kind of project possible. And so that's how we started working on bringing the exhibition here. And so in a sense, once this project was formed, the question was not so much how do we make this relevant to here, to Abu Dhabi, because the relevance was obvious. It was more, how do we create connections that will make it meaningful to bring it here, and that will make it meaningful both for the artists and for people in the UAE. And I think, Farah mentioned how in Egypt there was, this exhibition was something, or touched on something very deep, almost existential, right? Making an experience that was so usual, the migration to the Gulf, making it problematic. And I think here, in a sense, it was taken for granted in a different way, because it's an experience that is shared by many people, in fact, by the majority of the population of the UAE. But it tends to be discussed, especially in academia, through the lens of nationality or of professional occupation, and so in ways that tend to be very siloed. And so one of the questions was, how do we make it not just sort of a snapshot of Egyptian experiences that exist along other groups, but rather actively create these bridges across these groups and across these experiences. And so that's what the conversations that we curated around the exhibition were for. I mean, a lot of the actually very active engagement that Farida, Farah, and all of the artists who came, and many of them managed to come sometimes on their own funds to the UAE during the exhibition, through the engagement in the guided tours, etc., in many in a variety of ways, also created these bridges. But so the series of conversations that we organized, essentially the idea behind them was to sort of pull threads from the exhibition, thematic threads, and to build on them by bringing in other people in the conversation. And in a sense, it was very driven by the exhibition itself. And I think one reason why Being Borrowed is so remarkable is that it brings together academic and artistic approaches in a way that is very specific. But that also, but it's not just that, right? It also adds to knowledge in the sense that the way they've done this also allows new topics to emerge, and topics that have not necessarily been well addressed before. And so these conversations meant to build on these threads, on these topics. And so some of them were sort of what the exhibition allows to bring that academic writing cannot do, right? Which is the emphasis on the body, on voice also, through the cassette tapes, through some of the recordings and videos that were there, on play as well. And many of the installations were interactive and engaged the visitor in playing. And through these, also through being in the space, etc., there was an emphasis on domestic spaces and on material culture, right? The objects, the places, the furniture, the home in its very physical material dimension that allowed to connect it to this more immaterial dimension, which is family relations, but also sometimes the feeling of isolation of the family members who are in the Gulf and who are sometimes separated from the others. And so this question of the domestic space or the home in its very physical, very material presence, and of what circulates between the two homes or more that migrants have, in terms of very concrete objects and sometimes clutter. It's one of the artists, Lina Al-Shami, who was talking about this migration clutter that people keep in some very specific spaces in their home, the weight of the furniture, etc., was one of the threads that we looked at. Another, I think, important aspect of the exhibition, and one that makes part of its huge resonance with many people, including those who do not necessarily share these experiences, I think, is the approach through the affective and the intimate, through personal experiences. And so one of the threads that we put was this question of what are the traces of migration? What kind of intimate archives can become sort of these sites where to trace these experiences, even if they're not directly telling these stories, right? But how do we see it through these intimate archives? But also sometimes what are the non-traces, so what disappears also and what is being erased. And I think that's one of the themes that they managed to bring up very explicitly in the exhibition. You know, what do you forget about these experiences, or what gets untold? And another one was, or the last thread, in a sense, was the emphasis on language, on words, through voices, but also through stories, it's storytelling, and in particular storytelling around memories of the Gulf. That was sort of what the last thread that we looked at in these conversations. And I can stop here and hopefully we can build on that.
That's great. Thank you so much, Laure, for not just kind of walking us through where the exhibition, where the conversations around the exhibition traveled within the UAE. So you have locations from like Beit al-Mamzar to Warehouse 421 to, you know, kind of like more community-like spaces that were outside, you know, the realms of the university itself on Saadiyat. And so in that sense, you were also able to curate exactly what you just said so beautifully, a whole host of, I think, concepts that emerged from the exhibition, but also to have those conversations in this broader way, like with people who weren't originally involved with the exhibition itself, but for whom some of the themes of the exhibition resonate. And, you know, you mentioned the word archives, and I think that's such a great word, this idea of intimate archives. And in some ways, I think the UAE over the last 10 years has produced a ton of work on this kind of question, you know, like, for example, Lest We Forget, you know, like a documentation of like family photo albums. And what does it mean? In that particular project, it was mostly actually Emiratis, like really talking about how, you know, the fast pace of development can sometimes lead to this feeling of like, oh, these are memories, even though sometimes they're in the present moment, you know, and this really beautiful project, which was initially, I think, at Zayed University, but then also was brought to NYU Abu Dhabi and then expanded from there. Certainly also members of the South Asian community in the UAE have been doing this kind of work also for a very long time. So what's so great about, in some ways, what you've done, I think, with the programmatic work is you're also putting those in conversation together. Like, what do people from Egypt who lived in the Gulf under the same set of circumstances have to say to people from a different ethnicity or citizenship or whatever, and what emerges from that? So I think it's really, really very crucial, actually. And I guess really kind of in hearing from the three people who were involved, you know, in putting this together, from the conceptual piece to the exhibition space to the kind of curated programs around it, we can maybe think together as a group around, you know, how this kind of methodology is itself, you know, so powerful, really. And I say this not just from a place of, you know, viewing it from the outside, but also from the place of somebody who has always felt that the social sciences and the arts have so much to, in some ways, learn from each other. And so we heard Farah talk a lot about, you know, how it's anthropology, but it's also very personal. Like it's not to be divided. And in fact, if the starting point is that it's not to be divided, then what emerges? You can create a field, you know? I mean, that's a totally different way of understanding the kind of binaries that unfortunately sometimes are at the heart of very Western modern ideas about how to produce knowledge, you know? I'd love to just give each one of you also a chance to kind of tell us a little bit more about really what differentiates, in some ways, this kind of work that you're doing from, let's say, more standard modes or more acceptable mainstream modes of knowledge production, especially about our region. You know, in our class, Women and Work in the Gulf, a big part of it is actually learning how to theorize up, meaning it's not that we're reaching out to a theory and then slopping it here and saying, this is what we understand, but more like, how do we also theorize from within? How do we center even our own experiences, not just as students or people learning, but as people who happen to be here in this moment and live here? And so maybe, Farah, you can give us kind of a quick insight into your own view on this, given that actually prior to this exhibition, you had been working on anthropology bil-Arabi. And when I listened to some of your Instagram posts, that really are attempting to, in some ways, bridge anthropological knowledge with an Arab-speaking audience, but it's not just so much a kind of simple process of translation. It's like a critical take also on what constitutes anthropological knowledge and thinking critically about what are the bits and pieces that you would want to even call anthropology bil-Arabi.
Thank you, Mai. I'm now, I don't know, I get embarrassed when people watch the videos. I feel like because they were like old with like a sort of a very poor quality. So I'm sorry you had to watch it this way. But yeah, actually, I started with the YouTube videos you have seen, in an attempt to, publicize anthropology in a way that is relevant to us in the region as well. So that was important for me. So I would always try to relate concepts that are, that were coined somewhere else with relevant experiences for us here. But then slowly I started to tend to prefer workshops actually, because it's exactly in the workshops, what happens is exactly what you're speaking about, is that there is a chance for conversations to be created that are critical, collaborative, and that allow us to produce knowledge. So, masalan, and this relates to something that Farida was mentioning in the layout, memory. So, as also Farida mentioned, our framework, our conceptual framework, and also then became the curatorial framework, was the idea of temporariness, right? This wasn't where we started. This was something we recognized together, we felt together, and we understood together. So, memory was one thing that if we weren't doing this collaboratively, we wouldn't have understand, because I remember these sessions where everyone in the room realized that they can't remember their memories in the Gulf, 10 years, 15 years, 18 years of their lives. And everyone on their own, including myself, we thought that this was our own problem, right? Like, well, we're probably too young. We would have these excuses, but then finding a pattern together helped us. Well, maybe there is something else. Maybe it's the temporariness of it, but there's definitely something that we need to surface about memory, and it triggered so everyone was triggered but like not everyone, but at least 4 artists engaged with memory because they were so triggered by the idea that we can't remember, but they did it differently. Like Tasneem invited us to fictionalize, while Farida Rodi invited us to actually remember the mundane. And to me, this is what really is a different kind of producing knowledge, right? It's also because I liked how you mentioned the idea of affective traces, right? We engaged a lot with the idea of traces that we were allowed to leave in the Gulf or not, but also what traces were left on us on the affective level, I mean. So it was, I think this again, I would say the context of where the workshop was done, how was it done? So not being an academic setting, not thinking of the field as a geographical space, also was an anthropological starting point that allowed us to explore the emotions and understand them anthropologically better, and think of the field as a baggage that we carry. And also during the exhibitions themselves, like the amount of people who cried. I mean, Laure was making fun of me during the UAE exhibition because I was like looking for people who were crying, and 3 people cried today, things like that. But because really this was the kinds of, not that we want people to cry, but because these were the kinds of engagements that made the engagement profound, with the questions, like critical engagement, right? It wasn't only something people watch and leave, it was something they interrogate and feel and get touched by. So yeah, I think we were just trying to theorize together without without thinking that we're doing this, you know? We were just trying to problematize and understand, and then concepts like temporariness came, homes and understanding them. So we started the way around, I mean, like from emotions to theory, not I don't know if this makes sense, but yeah.
It makes complete sense. And I think it's so wonderful actually to hear, it's so refreshing actually, to hear such a strong case be made for the role of emotions in the creation of knowledge, which I think unfortunately for many of us or some of us, the academy almost like beats it out of you, right? Or like some parts of the academy where it's like meant to be like very in the head or to be analytical. You have to try to be objective or try to remove yourself from the thing. And here, like we hear this very strong intervention for a different kind of mode. And I think a mode that I've personally found very productive, not just for myself, but for my students and certainly for some of my colleagues. And so maybe we can here move to Laure, because I think this is also something that she's in her own work very attuned to. And I would love, Laure, if you can tell us a little bit about kind of in some ways how the work that emerged from this exhibition, or let's say the knowledge that emerged from this exhibition sits alongside your broader understanding or broader category of Arab in the Gulf.
Yeah, maybe first about also the method. You know, one thing is, I mean, the question of emotions was a very important thread, and I think there's something very sort of similar there's already sort of many convergences between anthropological work and artistic work in the sense that it's also bridging sort of the micro experience, you know, the individual scale and sort of broader, more universal or more theoretical questions, right? And so I think that in that sense, the processes tend to be very similar, except that usually in anthropological work, the result is a book with a single author who's the anthropologist, you know, and that has been contested in the history of the discipline, and you know, it's been emphasized how collaborative anthropological work or field work usually is, right? Because there's no sort of idea that doesn't come from interactions with interlocutors, etc. And so, you know, especially when these interlocutors are intervening in artistic spheres, etc., it becomes absolutely impossible to not include them in that process. And so, I think for me, what was absolutely great about bringing the exhibition here and organizing all of this was that it gave me access to this collaborative aspect of research, you know, in ways that are that usually have to be silenced, or that the usual outcomes of academic research do not allow to foreground as much as we would want to, or or as would be necessary actually to recognize who participated in that. So I think that, you know, that was one of the very important things. And I think in terms of the category of Arabs in the Gulf, I'm not entirely sure that I claim the existence of this category in a sense. I mean, but one of the sort of main things I've been trying to get at through this category was basically to, on the one hand, sort of trivialize the distinction between citizens and non-citizens. That is usually one that is sort of foregrounded in scholarly research, which usually looks at one of these categories separately from the other, and also within the sort of migrant category, looks at different ones, but rather to look at how, especially for young people who have grown up in these contexts, their experiences are shaped by this coexistence, or by the presence of all of these groups. The urban landscape itself is shaped by this diversity. Many of the practices and many of the experiences are shaped by it in various ways. Obviously, in ways that can also be violent, that can also be hierarchical, that are not sort of, I'm not saying that everybody is having the same experience, but it's an experience that is shaped by this. And people's subjectivities also are being shaped by this. And that comes back a bit to what Farida was saying about sort of the psychological aspect of these experiences in certain ways. And so I think in that sense, the exhibition also gives access to a part of these subjectivities and actually demonstrates this in a very important way, right? That even when you return, and even if you return as a young adult and you don't necessarily come back to the Gulf, or you might travel back at some point, your experience, your subjectivity, your personhood is transformed by the experience of migration, right? And in a sense, even if you stay, but someone else in your family goes, it does transform you as well. And so I think that's actually a very sort of, in that sense, you know, really adds an important dimension to this topic. I'm not sure if I've really answered the question.
Yeah, no, that's really great. And actually what I wanted to just to say here before we transition to Farida is in some ways, I think sometimes categories trap us into a particular way of thinking and feeling. And they can be important because they're a starting point for something, or they're a way to bring the community together. But sometimes actually challenging the category and thinking kind of in a more processual way, like the process itself. So one of the things Farah mentioned, for example, is this question of temporary migration regime. And so, for example, you had one artist, in fact, whose experience was in Libya, I think, because it's the migration regime of the temporariness, actually, that was really at the heart of the thing, and not just the question of geographically the Gulf. But I think at this particular moment in history that we're all living through, where we see what's happening to Palestinians in Gaza, we're witnessing the conflict in Sudan and Egypt, is actually a location where potentially it's receiving many people who are crossing borders and will now become a host location. So I think the kind of conversations that you're really surfacing in this work can potentially be really transformative of other groups who maybe are not Egyptian migrants to the Gulf, but are migrants to Egypt under a different set of circumstances, you know? And questions of solidarity, which I think for many of us are really top of mind right now. Like, how do we do this? How do we do this in a different way? How do we do this under a set of like really severe constraints? I think could be really, really fantastic. And so I guess, Farida, perhaps one last question for me before we open it up to people in the room, is this question of, you know, what does it mean for somebody who's been in some ways, you know, educated as an art historian, who's done curation in kind of formal exhibitions spaces, to work with, I mean, one article, I think it was The National, or maybe it was Gulf News, I can't remember, said the word amateur artists. And I was like, you guys have no idea what you're saying. Like, these people are way more critical than you're giving them credit for. It's not
Yeah,
about
we were all like, we really all questioned. Sorry, we all questioned their choice of word, actually.
Yeah, I was like, you know, in my mind, like when I went to this exhibition, I was like, wow, the statement that I'm getting from this space is like, everybody is an artist. Everybody has the right to create. Everybody has a right to center their experience, you know? So I'd love to just hear from you as somebody who's trained in the field. What was that like for you? What was the experience? And how was it perhaps different? I don't know, or similar maybe to your experience working with, let's say, more established or professional artists?
I think in this exhibition in particular, because I was working first with an experience that I had myself, kind of imitate the sense of the friendship that actually happened in the workshop itself. So what was really amazing about this workshop was, Farah said, the collective sense that was created, and the exhibition was seen as a way to kind of mimic that, and to allow the audience to also feel it, so that you could see a relationship between two artworks that you hadn't considered, not just because they were standing next to each other, but because the two artists developed a different way a similar way of talking about themselves. And in return, what I wanted to do was to make the audience as receptive, not to the information that they were getting, but rather to the experiences that they were invited to live through. Because at times, it was very humbling, actually, to see how the artist opened up so much about themselves to me, who was kind of a bit of a stranger to them, and especially because I had not shared that experience, and so it almost added more responsibility to. But nicely, I was very happy to kind of present it as delicately and as gently as I could.
Thank you, Farida, for that. That's really very beautiful. And, I think this, expression that you had of curator as healer, in some ways is something I felt, even though I hadn't met you prior to this call, because it felt like those kinds of spaces in the exhibition were done with so much care. I mean, the kind of energy that you felt when you walked into that space, it really, really permeated. So thank you. And I'd love to kind of open up the conversation also for people in the room, perhaps to, riff off some of those questions, or if you have something specific that you'd like to ask. We have some people who, are in the class, but we also have people who are not, people who have just joined the call because they're interested in this exhibition or in the conversation. So if you have a question, if you could please just indicate that with your emoji, and I can call on you, and then we can take them in order. Rania?
First of all, thank you so much for taking time to talk about your work. This was all very, very interesting. I guess I'm curious to know, in your description of the work, it sounds like it's a very, very personal like reflection of the experiences that people have gone through, and so there's already a concern, I think, in trying to like organize or curate an exhibition that can encapsulate like the diversity of those experiences. But I think then when Farah, you were talking about opening up the exhibition to like the community and collaborations, I guess, were there any concerns in how that would work in like putting the project together, and while you were doing that and while everyone was working on that, were there challenges that arise in trying to basically like explain through the art like the very different aspects of what Egyptian migration represents? Because it's not, I feel like, yeah, just that.
Okay, thank you, Rania, for the question. So I assume you're asking about the exhibition that went to the UAE, yeah? Because because it was yeah, and then Laura also have, I think we have a lot of things to say, Farida, as well, about it going to the Gulf. Because in Egypt it was very, everyone was Egyptian, and it was very, very emotional, as I mentioned. Um, but also when we were taking it to the UAE, some people were like making us be very concerned about how people from the Gulf would actually encounter that. How would they receive it? How would they welcome it or unwelcome it? But actually, what we have realized was that most of the people who were from the Gulf, like Emiratis or Bahrainis or Saudis who visited the exhibition, they actually were very emotional. They weren't offended as some people had assumed earlier. And which we also thought was very condescending, that some people saying that people from the Gulf would just automatically be offended. They had a very profound engagement, actually, sometimes mixed with guilt. But many of them cried as well. And this was the thing that we didn't encounter doing the same exhibition in Egypt. So that was the thing. The other thing was also Laure's programming was, يعني she spoke about it, but I also find it was very, very beautifully done, where she made sure that each conversation was as diverse as possible. And to us, this was very enlightening because it had put the experience of being borrowed or of the Egyptians that was also middle class. That's something important to mention, that working class experience, even if they were Egyptians, would probably be a bit different. but it put our experiences in conversations with artists and scholars who are working on, or they are personally from, or have experienced these migratory experience from South Asia, from Ethiopia, from the Philippines, from Palestine. And this was very enlightening, right? It was, you could see a lot of commonalities, but there were a lot of differences, and there were a lot of realizations on how we always speak in bubbles. So that was something that was brought up a lot as well, but it was brought up mainly in the conversations rather than the the exhibition. However, people were also the one other thing that was different in the public encounter compared to the UAE's iteration and the Cairo iteration was the age aspect, that the parents' age in Egypt were very moved. They sometimes felt guilty, they sometimes cried, they sometimes came more than one time. But the same generation, even if they were Egyptians who visited the exhibition in UAE, had sort of a defensive kind of reaction. Why are you making it sound like a very, a harsh experience? We're successful, we did this, we achieved this and that. And it made sense, right? They have to have these notions, and I mean have these feelings towards something they are still living. So it hit home harder sort of in Cairo. um yeah, I don't know if I know I didn't directly engage with your question. I was just recalling the different engagements in the exhibition. But yeah, we were very concerned about that. We're bringing a very particular experience, like Egyptian experience, to the Gulf, and most of the audience who came were not actually the Egyptians. But still, as Mai said, that the exhibition surfaces so many things that also sounds a bit more universal, even if you didn't go to the Gulf altogether, right? People who are just bypassing still could relate to these ideas of home, movement, memory, father figure, yeah.
That's so great. Thank you so much, Farah. And I think we have a question from Sadam Sefer.
Thank you so much, May. Thank you, everyone, for just giving us another beautiful this flavor of the exhibition. I was one of the lucky ones who was able to make it to the exhibition, and I also encouraged my students, and from the feedback that I received from them, they were all very moved and intrigued and had a lot of questions. So I'll make sure to share those with you when they share them with me. I guess to make it short, I really appreciated May's question earlier about how space and place kind of conditioned and the sort of the emergence of this particular sort of iteration of this exhibition at NYUAD. My mind is also taking me to how, like, a curiosity about how gender and class conditioned the coming together of sort of this particular artistic exhibition, but also like the bonding that happened among the artists and the weaving and braiding of the stories that were narrated. And I'm wondering if somebody can reflect on that, if that resonates with you at all. And thank you so much.
Farida, would you like to take this question?
Sure. Thank you, Sarah. Actually, I remember we had a small conversation about the exhibition when I was in Abu Dhabi. So thank you for joining us again. I think the bonding was because I arrived at it after the workshops had happened. So the bonding was, to me, something that I really wanted to keep in the exhibition itself. I don't really think that it was something that I actively did, but knowing that friendship was what brought everyone together. It wasn't about just separating the artworks into different nukes or into different pieces of information, but rather about how we could experience them as one conversation leading on to another that actually happened over a few set of weeks. You said about the age group and the class issue. I do think that the age group made a difference. These were people who had this experience probably over, I mean, around the same amount of time. So that meant going back to what Farah was saying, that collectively the gender and class, gender and class. Oh, okay, all right. Well, then I would speak more about class then. I think that the class element was something that was actually intentionally created by Farah. It doesn't really surface in the exhibition as a key to understanding the experience, but I think it's just something that the exhibition itself just built up on without really having to justify it or to think about it more concretely. I do remember that there was a conversation in the Cairo programming with, I think, Samuli Shuki about how migration to the Gulf is experienced differently by the working class. But what I think comes up in this exhibition is how my own how this generation just reflects differently about their experiences and how we can take seriously their points of views as alternative modes of knowledge production. I don't know if that answers the question entirely.
Thank you so much, Farida. So I think maybe actually we'll start to bring this to a close. And already, there were like one or two people who touched on kind of this thing of like, something surprising, like it wasn't part of the plan, but then it ended up happening, But I just wanted to invite maybe Laure, is there anything that you want to share with us that you think sort of was like something totally unexpected, but that, ended up being like a major insight for you?
That's a good question. I don't know if there was anything unexpected. I mean, I guess one thing that I wasn't sure of was the reception of the exhibition, and how many people, because we were trying very hard to sort of also get it out of the NYUAD campus and, reach out to the community. But that's also something that I hadn't done so far in the UAE. And, I was aware of the conversations that were happening elsewhere. I had some connections to some of the people operating in those spaces, but I wasn't completely sure of, are people actually gonna, gonna receive it and gonna engage with it? And I think that was actually kind of really beautiful to see how even, the UAE-based artists that we invited to the conversations, for example, who actually showed up to all of them, or to most of them, and who sort of engage with this in the longer term. But also, visitors who, I mean, many times we came to the exhibition space and there were these same people that we had seen 2 days before, but they had brought a new friend, because they thought that person actually needed to see it. And that happened recurrently. And that was really great to see. That was something where, when people actually want others to see it and want also to, I guess, observe the others' reactions to the materials, etc. So I feel like it has also seeded conversations in a way, among many other people, and some of which we've been able to capture through asking people for feedback, through keeping in touch with the people who attended the conversations, through all of the also ways embedded in the exhibition to actually, collect people's thoughts, memories, experiences, etc. That can be the basis for further work. But I think that, there's also probably even more than that has been created. And I think also maybe just to touch on Sarah's question about bonding, it was very fascinating to me to see how every one of the artists who came, and Farah and Farida obviously, was able to talk about everyone's work. Like, everybody knew exactly what the others had done and was able to basically give an entire tour of the exhibition. And that was really great to see.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Laure. And actually, this is sort of a perfect segue, maybe to kind of just a closing reflection, since, that's the title in a way of our conversation today, Reflections on Being Borrowed, because sometimes, after the thing is over, you have a little bit of distance from it that you can kind of, pull out in a way or make sense of what happened, as it was unfolding. But I'm going to share this one image, which is in fact the image that we chose to kind of like, in a way, advertise, this talk online, both on Haraka Lab, but also Anthropology bil Arabi. And this image is not from the exhibition itself, but it was an image of an image that was taken in the exhibition. And so the person holding this small little photo is Iman, one of the artists in the exhibition. And this photo is actually a photo of Farah and Laure and myself and two of the artists who are Tasneem and Iman. And we were sort of like hanging out at the exhibition, having a cool conversation about all sorts of things. And then a young woman, a student at NYU Abu Dhabi, asked us if we wanted a picture, because she had one of these like old school Kodak camera things. And we're like, you know what, sure. So we stood around, I don't know, you can't really see it really very clearly here, but it was al-kursi al-mudhab, which is this sort of, I don't know what the right word would be, but help me out here, guys. Golden Baroque style, or how would you describe it?
I think Lena calls it golden glided salon, something like that.
Oh yeah, the gilded salon. So sort of like this one piece that's supposed to sort of, I guess, represent this idea of the dreams of establishing a home where you can receive guests and impress them with your furniture. But you can also see maybe a little bit from this image that the chair itself is covered, right? It's covered with a white cloth because it's meant to keep it safe, clean, and secure, but in the process, it never gets used, right? And so it was a really interesting piece, actually, of this exhibition. And here we stood around it. And in fact, Farah herself sat on it, which I feel like is a nice statement.
They pressured me to sit on it. So that's something I need to.
Yeah, and so she took this picture and then she offered it back to us. And she said, I took this picture because actually I really enjoyed this exhibition. And I wanted to give something back to it. And I had noticed that she was in fact taking pictures of multiple things in the exhibition and giving those images out. And so what was so beautiful for me in that moment is that, like what you were saying earlier, Farah, rather than just simply being offended or, like assuming a kind of very simplistic, uniform reaction that somebody would have simply because they belong to a certain category. In fact, what had happened is this person was not only the recipient of information from the exhibition, but a very willing participant in co-creating knowledge with the exhibition and with the people in it. And so really, it was wonderful to witness that. It was wonderful to be with you physically in that space and to have those conversations. And I'm also really grateful that you're continuing to have those conversations with this class, with my lab, and hopefully in many, many other spaces to come. I think so much to unpack here, and it's something that I think will continue to grow and evolve over time, and we look forward to hearing about it and supporting it as it continues, So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mai.
Thank you.
Yeah, that means a lot. Shukran.